It was the kind of cold that bit through steel. Washington, D.C., January 13th, 1982. A historic snowstorm had dropped nearly 7 inches of snow on the Capitol, the most in decades. Roads were paralyzed. Federal offices had shut down early. Traffic choked every bridge and avenue. The city, built on political inertia, was now frozen in place. But at Washington National Airport, one flight still prepared for takeoff. Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737, scheduled to fly from D.C. to Fort Lauderdale with a stopover in Tampa. On board were 74 passengers and 5 crew members, business travelers, vacationers, families escaping the storm. At the controls, Captain Larry Wheaton, 34 years old, and First Officer Roger Pettit, 31. Both were relatively new to Air Florida, and both were former military pilots. They were confident, capable, but that day, confidence would clash with caution, and caution would lose. It was 2:20 p.m. when Flight 90 finally pushed back from Gate 12. Already, they were hours behind schedule. De-icing trucks had been in high demand all day, and every flight needed extra attention. When Flight 90 was finally sprayed down, it had already been sitting on the tarmac far longer than recommended. The engines were running, the wings were heavy with snow, and the mistakes were just beginning. As the plane waited for clearance, the pilots made a decision, one that would prove fatal. To conserve engine heat and avoid further delay, they left the engine anti-ice systems off. They assumed the de-icing fluid had done its job, and that once they got moving, the engine heat would be enough. But that assumption was wrong. In the cockpit, First Officer Pettit expressed concern. "That doesn't seem right," he said, glancing at the engine pressure readings. The instruments showed that the engines were underperforming. But Captain Wheaton dismissed it. The two men had flown together before. They were friends. But the cockpit dynamic was clear. Wheaton was in command, and Pettit was deferential. They reached the runway at 3:59 p.m. Visibility was poor. Snow was falling again. But the tower gave them clearance. Flight 90 lined up on runway 36 and began to accelerate. Inside the cabin, passengers gripped their armrests. Some glanced nervously out the frosted windows. Others stared straight ahead, focused on the escape from the cold. But something was wrong. The engines didn't roar. They groaned. The aircraft struggled to gain speed. The nose lifted, but the climb was sluggish. Pettit warned again, "We're not going anywhere." Seconds later, the plane staggered into the air. But it wasn't flying. It was sinking. Barely a mile from the runway, the Boeing 737 clipped the 14th Street Bridge. The left wing struck the top of a car, then a truck, then sheared off. The fuselage slammed into the bridge deck, crushing vehicles and tearing open the underside of the plane. Then, still mostly intact, the aircraft plunged into the icy Potomac River. It was 4:01 p.m. Only 4 minutes had passed since takeoff, and in that time, 78 people had entered a nightmare. The Potomac in January is not just cold, it's lethal. Water temperatures hovered just above freezing. Ice flows clogged the channel. Survival time in that water was measured in minutes, not hours. The crash had shattered the plane into 3 major sections. The tail and most of the fuselage sank immediately. The cockpit and a portion of the forward cabin floated for a few agonizing minutes, just long enough for a few survivors to escape. Only 6 people were pulled alive from the wreckage, 5 passengers, and 1 flight attendant. The rest, passengers, crew, drivers on the bridge, were either killed instantly or drowned in the freezing water. And yet, amid the tragedy, something unforgettable happened. Witnesses on the bridge had seen everything. One of the first to act was Lenny Skutnik, a 28-year-old government employee who had been stuck in traffic on the 14th Street Bridge. When he saw a woman in the water struggling to stay afloat, he didn't hesitate. He threw off his coat, jumped into the river, and swam to her. That woman was Priscilla Tirado. Her husband had died in the crash. Her infant son, too. She had nothing left. But Lenny pulled her out of the water and back into life. Another survivor, a man later identified as Arlen D. Williams, Jr., was seen repeatedly passing the rescue line to others. When a U.S. Park Police helicopter arrived and dropped a lifeline, Williams caught it, but instead of using it, he handed it to the woman next to him. Then to another. Then another. He passed the rope 5 times, never once taking it for himself. By the time the chopper came back for him, he was gone. Pulled under by the current, killed not by the crash, but by his own selflessness. His name was never known to the public until weeks later, but when President Ronald Reagan gave his State of the Union address later that month, he honored Williams' sacrifice. And years later, the 14th Street Bridge was renamed in his memory, the Arlen D. Williams, Jr. Memorial Bridge. But what caused the crash? The investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board was exhaustive. They analyzed the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recordings, the weather, the maintenance logs, and what they found was chilling. The crash had been entirely preventable. The root cause was ice. Despite having been de-iced earlier, the plane had sat on the runway too long. Snow continued to fall, and the engine's anti-ice systems had remained off. By the time the plane began its takeoff roll, the wings were contaminated with ice, and the engine sensors were unreliable. Worse, the pilots didn't recognize or ignored the signs. First Officer Pettit had questioned the instruments multiple times. He'd called out the low engine pressure. He'd said they weren't gaining speed, but Captain Wheaton, either confident or distracted, brushed it aside. Neither man performed the standard visual check for wing ice, by simply opening the cockpit window and leaning out to look. Had they done so, they would have seen the problem. But no one looked, and by the time the plane lifted off, it was already doomed. The crash of Air Florida Flight 90 changed aviation. It led to sweeping changes in cold weather operations. Pilots were trained more rigorously on de-icing protocols, cockpit resource management, and how to recognize the often subtle signs of engine failure and lift loss due to ice. But the human stories stayed longer than the policy changes. There were families who waited at Tampa and Fort Lauderdale that day, watching the clock, wondering why their loved ones hadn't arrived. There were motorists on the bridge who had no idea their day would end in fire and water. And there were survivors, each with their own ghosts. Priscilla Tirado never fully recovered. Her grief became a lifelong wound. Kelly Duncan, the flight attendant who survived, said she carried the pain of that day in silence for years. And the memory of Arlen Williams lived on, not because he was a hero in uniform, not because he had trained for this, but because, in the worst moment of his life, he put others first. That's the kind of tragedy that leaves a scar on a city, and a lesson for us all. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.